breaking the action.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's a good way to end the week.
Definitely.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started then. I'm sure there'll be some other people joining as we kind of begin our conversation, so we'll get started this morning. So good morning, everybody. It's great to have everyone here. Happy Friday. As Chris just mentioned, happy Friday to everybody. Wonderful to be here. It's hard to believe it's the last Friday of June, first half of the year. It certainly has been interesting and active and full of all kinds of events, as we all know. So we'll see how the back half of the year goes. But I hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy and hopefully staying busy out there also. We've got a really great conversation set up for this morning with Steve. So he and I connected about a year or so ago, a little over a year ago, and have been talking ever since about different ways that we can get him involved in the group. And so it's great to have him here this morning. I want to do a couple of just quick shout outs also. So my name is Ken Schmitt. I think I know just about most of all of you on the call this morning, but we actually founded the group, the Sales and Marketing Leadership Alliance, back in 2011. We've got chapters spread throughout Southern California. And as many of you know, we've been trying to get our Austin chapter off the ground as well. A little bit of a pause thanks to COVID, but we are excited about launching our virtual chapter beginning next month in July. And so July 9th will be our first Austin speaker. It's actually John Ford, who was our Austin chapter president also. He was a football coach for Florida, in Florida for a number of years, and then made the transition from coaching and professional athletics over to sales and sales leadership. And he now works at Dialpad. So it's going to be a lot of fun to have him on as our speaker on July 9th. So we'll look forward to seeing you all there. So the group itself, SMLA, if you aren't familiar with it, we have about 100 members, 110 members spread throughout the country. We just launched our virtual membership as well last month, which has been getting quite a bit of notoriety and visibility, which has been great for to give folks a chance to take advantage of being part of the group, even if they're not in a city where there's a physical chapter also. So welcome to all of our virtual members too. I do want to give a shout out also to our sponsors. We've had these sponsors for, in some cases, quite a few years, 7, 8, 9 years. And they all do a fantastic job of helping us to spread the word about the group, getting us great ideas for speakers and topics also. And it's nice to have those supporters out there. So everybody that is part of the group that's a sponsor gets a little more visibility for us. And we really appreciate that. So we have folks from Out and About Communications that develop web and brand strategies. We've got Amy Rasdall from Billable at the Beach also on the training and coaching side. Very strong operations background from Amy. We have Phil Ferrari, who is our resident video expert. All the videos that you see on our SMLA website were shot and edited by Phil. We've got Marsh McLennan, of course. When we do go back to having our in-person events, we use their space here in San Diego. So they're great on the insurance side. We have both Craig and Roxanne also from FranNet, and we have Ryan from Replica Printing. So that's great. And I'm not sure if Brian Jackson's on this morning also, but Terry and Rob Sweetie have been part of the group for a long time with Sales Growth Associates, and they were just merged into a different Sandler practice. So Brian Jackson is now the head of that practice. So welcome to everybody. We're glad to have you all here. As you know, this is meant to be a very engaging conversation. We don't want it to be just a monologue with myself and Steve spouting all of our ideas. We really want to keep this engaging and get your questions and comments as well. So please go ahead, feel free to use the chat at any point. Any questions that you have, please feel free to launch them there. And Steve's got a pretty broad background with a lot of different portions of his business that are spread throughout the US. So we'll get into that conversation also. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. Steve, welcome this morning. First of all, thank you for being here. I know you're based up in Orange County, not too far up the road from where I am in Carlsbad. So it's great to have you here. Why don't you give us an introduction for yourself and kind of your business on the consulting side with Blanc Strategies? That'd be great.
Well, thank you, Ken, and good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to some of you. I appreciate this opportunity. So let me take a few minutes and just kind of ground you on my experience. So the bulk of my career was spent at Beckman Coulter, and I started with Beckman actually as a sales rep. So I had a very long career there, The last 12 years, I was vice president of the life science and the diagnostic testing parts of Beckman Coulter. But and normally, I stumble a bit because I hesitate to, go through all my career aspects. So I don't want to get too locked into that. But I think there is relevancy here in that I was with one company, which is, I know, kind of an anomaly in life. I spent the first 8 years with Beckman as a field sales rep. So I was selling capital equipment for the life science business in Texas and basically capital equipment. And then I spent 6 years as a sales manager for Beckman, and I had about 5-6 states, 10 sales reps, and did that for 6 years, again, in the life science business, selling capital equipment to researchers and pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology companies. And then I moved to California and took an area manager job, today more known as an area director type role. So I had the western part of the US, again, for life science, and then a variety of different roles within life science, eventually vice president of the global commercial customer operations. And then I transferred over to the diagnostic business, which is very different market, different buying drivers for value from our hospital markets. And I spent 6 years running the diagnostic business. And so I got a chance to see what a company goes through in changes and how that affects the sales organization, the service organization, because I was responsible for service and applications too. We went through acquisitions, we went through divestitures, we went through 9/11, we went through the crash in 1987, we went through very, very decreased federal funding for research. We went through, good times with a lot of funding for research. We went through a variety of different challenges and transformed as a company. And I think that's relevant to the conversations that we may have today. Because while I think what we face now with the coronavirus and the pandemic is unique, and I don't want to imply that I sit here with all the answers on how to get through that, but it is a crisis, and the effect on individuals personally is front of mind. And I think that my career, again, 8 years as a sales rep, 6 years as a sales manager, helped me be effective in my advanced career as an executive at the company, and helps me now keep context and perspective about what we're going through. I retired from Beckman in 2012, a year after the acquisition by Danaher, and I'll save that for another story. But the reality is, I then kind of began a consulting practice. I went through kind of developing what my new chapter would look like, and so now I'm involved in helping companies kind of navigate strategic sales planning, tactics, development. How do you develop a strategic sales plan that's going to get you where you want to get? And I'm also very involved relative to the COVID epidemic with the National Institutes of Health, kind of evaluating companies and academic research institutions for solutions to the testing challenge, which is a paramount issue in raising confidence that where you go and when you go, you're going to be safe, or you're not, asymptomatically being infected or infecting people. So I can talk a little bit more about that, but staying engaged professionally is very important to me, and so I'm very much enjoying the life I lead now. But again, I think the context of what we're facing now, while challenging a lot of lessons on things that have worked in the past, will work certainly now.
No, that's great. Thank you. Appreciate you giving us that kind of backdrop with your career. And I know you've done a lot of different things along the way. And as we all can attest to, right, you never know for sure how something that you learned, 10, 15, 20 years ago is going to come back and make you that much of a better strategist or consultant or business leader, down the road. But every little data point along the way, helps to make us better. That's for sure. Give it, if you would, Steve. I'm curious. So let's kind of start with this question. So the clients that you've had, let's say for the last 6 months, so clients that you had pre-COVID and that you're still working with today, talk to us about how and if their strategies, their kind of priorities, if you will, have shifted.
Well, I think that we're all kind of learning as we go along. So companies initially react to these kinds of things in kind of a control the bleeding, if you will, control the cost. So a lot of discussion about the cost side of the equation and how we can pull back and conserve cash or position ourselves with our balance sheet in a stronger way. So that's probably the biggest change that I've seen. There is a move from growing revenue to protecting customer relationships or maintaining customer relationships, thinking in terms of the customer. So the front end of the business has been obviously very challenging. And I think companies have been learning as they go along. And so in my experience, it's really been, how do we support our customers through this pandemic in a distinct and differentiated way? Mm-hmm. And so obviously there are communications that take place through video, as we're seeing here. There's prioritized shipments, working with your best customers to make sure they have what they need to be successful, and really thinking about managing your customer relationships in a different way.
And are you seeing, I know there was, as you said, in the beginning, it tends to be a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. Some companies decided to close physical spaces, permanently. Others are doing it temporarily. Some decided to cut staff right away, even before they knew exactly what they would need to do. And others just kind of, like you said, kind of took a bit of a wait and see approach. Let's see if it gets worse. Let's kind of, try to level things off if we can. Are you seeing a more consistent pattern setting in now, or is it still really kind of case by case?
Well, I think obviously case by case plays a role, but I have one client that is looking at office space, right? And all of the plans associated with expansion, and in fact, they're looking to pull back. So I have a contact at a major hospital system in New York City, for example, that has probably half a million square feet of office space around, and they're looking to get out of every one of those leases. So there is a lot of introspection about how and where work gets done. So that's been kind of the one of the near-term things that I've seen is reduction in expansion ideas, or in some cases companies are taking advantage. They've been thinking about it, but now there's a pathway to do it. So companies always kind of think in terms of how to maximize, what's that phrase that was said, don't let a bad thing go to waste. So companies are cleaning out where they can, which of course puts a lot of angst on employees in many different ways, because, like the book, who moved my cheese? A lot of that cheese is being moved.
Yeah, exactly right. Or the cheese is just completely disappearing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No one knows where's the cheese.
But I think companies are settling in to the strategic question of the way we work in an office environment. Not to mention there's cost impacts. If people come back, it's not only, I have one client that invested, $120,000 just to make the office plexiglass and added cleaning and, no more, lots of space between desks. This costs money. and they're grappling with how to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was talking to several HR executives over the past week about that same topic. Is, these are expenses that are now going to be embedded in their overall, operating expenses, if you will. And you can't really, you can't bill, clients for that. You can't pass that cost along to customers. That's something that the businesses have to absorb just to bring their people back in the office. So it's part of the calculation to determine whether or not it makes sense to bring folks back to the office or allow them to continue working from home remotely. It's a big conversation in the recruiting world where I live and breathe every day about whether or not companies are finally going to actually embrace the fact that, oh, I can hire somebody maybe not in my own backyard and instead maybe in a less expensive part of the country with the same skill set and now manage them remotely. It'll save me costs, both in terms of not having to have a physical cubicle space, but also in terms of hiring in a less expensive part of the country, especially if we're talking about, New York, Southern California, the Bay Area.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Things that weren't possible, at least in my experience, are now. So this NIH initiative I'm involved in with, a rapid development of a diagnostic test for coronavirus. None of us know each other. And here we are operating, essentially flying a plane and building it at the same time, because there's no processes in place for this kind of an effort. And NIH has really challenged us to find a solution to this testing problem. And I'm dealing with people from corporate entities in, Minneapolis or Chicago, and then academic entities associated with those companies in Boston or Atlanta, and everything in between. And we're all able to connect and work through productively and get after something that requires us to work together on a project. And I got to tell you, I don't know if this would have been possible to the extent that we're needing to move. We're driving for a test by the fall, and we're working with over 2,000 proposals to assess, which ones are going to get us across the finish line. So there's scientific analysis we need to engage with consultants and physicians and researchers. There's obviously business, manufacturing, distribution, all these elements of building out infrastructure. And I don't know if we could have done it. And coronavirus has forced us into this ability to communicate and engage in this virtual environment at a level that we never thought we ever would or could. And I think it's opened up some eyes to, on both sides of the aisle. For employees, obviously, no commute, and all the things that we're all experiencing from that perspective. And for companies, getting after things pretty quickly at a relatively low cost.
Yeah,
exciting.
I agree. It's interesting. It's the kind of thing where, over the last couple of years, I know I've mentioned this in previous conversations and webinars also, but, the last couple of years, there's been a pretty kind of a heightened demand from the employee side to want to be able to work from home. And even a couple of days a week, because technology allows for it, and to have to commute into the office when, the commutes were so bad just, 4 months ago, we all kind of forgetting how bad commutes were. It was just kind of a very inefficient use of their time. But most companies were kind of reluctant to allow their employees to work from home. They just had this, what I call line of sight management style, where if I can't see you, I can't verify that you're being productive. But now this has forced so many companies across every conceivable industry to not only consider it, but be forced to actually invest, in the security and the VPNs and technology and everything else out there to allow a work from home workforce. And so we'll see how that plays out long term. We had a really interesting question from Joseph asking about the mental health piece. So we talk a lot about training and quotas and sales and all kind of the hard metrics, but this has taken a toll on everybody mentally as well. My wife is a therapist, and she's converted all her clients to telehealth. And I can tell you, she has not only has she not slowed down, she now has a waiting list of clients, right? There's a lot of angst and anxiety out there Are you seeing much with your clients and even with the NIH talking about how companies can and should address the mental health issues that have been created among employees?
So the short answer is yes, and I think that here's where maybe some context and some of my experience might be helpful to share. When I was at Beckman, and I'm not going to go into all the details associated with this, but we experienced an FDA recall, and it was on a very important test that the company had, and it materially affected the company. So. And I'll give you a quick analogy on what this is equivalent to. The FDA is very direct about what you can do with drugs and tests and what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of doing. And you have to be very specific about that. So the script, if you will, of what you tell customers you can do in the medical world is very defined for all the right reasons. So we had a test where we had a labeling issue where NIH kind of NIH is on my mind. FDA kind of moved the dial and said, we need to redefine what we're saying that's for. So here's the analogy: Starbucks coffee. So Starbucks coffee serves coffee, but they serve a lot of other things. And so it was equivalent to somebody going into Starbucks coffee that supplies their coffee and saying, we can't sell you any more cups or teas or lemonades or cookies or food because you're Starbucks coffee and all you can sell is coffee. So it was that kind of a change. And we had to go to our customers that were, let's say, franchises at Starbucks coffee and say, we can't sell you anything anymore because we're not allowed to. You're a coffee place and that's all you can sell. My point is that it was very disruptive to the relationships that our customers have with our company because for obvious reasons. And that lays upon the sales organization and lays upon the service organization because they're in front of the customers and they're the person that has the relationship and they're who the customer sees as the company. And it's very stressful. And so when I think about today, while it's obviously much more dramatic, a lot of salespeople and a lot of people in front of customers are incapable of carrying out their business. And layer on all the financial struggles that companies are going through and the changes. And it does have emotional and psychological effects on people. It's a lot of stress. So what kind of things are companies trying to do to help employees through that, right? And what we did was, and it's paramount, and again, it's not rocket science, it's being transparent and communicating to people regularly about what the company is thinking and what they're doing, and helping people work through that professionally, which includes being cognizant and validating that the problems that they're facing emotionally and the uncertainties this causes are real, and trying to provide some context and perspective for them so that they can see that we are going to get through this, and use whatever resources and energies we can to help people get through it. It's difficult because you can't make guarantees, and I always learned through my career that you have to kind of prepare people. People used to think at Beckman's was 80-year-old company, and we're family and we're always here for each other. And I would encourage people that's pardon my French, that's simply bullshit. Companies think about themselves, and at the end of the day, employees are not necessarily they're going to be layoffs, there's going to be changes, and that can affect you. And you have to think about being employable and taking the resources that the company has to train and develop yourself so that you're always current and able to stay valuable within the marketplace. So that's kind of a longer term issue where you keep people aware that nothing's forever. You can reference Kodak, you can reference GE, you can reference Blockbuster. People that thought, we're here forever are gone. And some of us on the call can remember, companies like, AT&T or any number of different companies where, they were powerhouses never to be compromised. But then there's a short-term aspect where I think you have to be transparent with people, communicate, and be, what I like to say, be a thermostat and not a thermometer. Especially first-line leaders, it's important that you set the tone and not let the temperature of the room influence you.
That's a great metaphor. I love that, the thermostat versus a thermometer. It's
right.
It's obviously
some bosses,
very,
you call them up and you don't know what you're going to get when you call.
Yeah, exactly right. It's
because
very relevant
maybe their
in a lot of
boss
ways.
jumped at them or something happened. So being a thermostat means you're always steady. You're always on top of what your emotions are.
Okay.
Always.
Exactly. Well, and I think also it's a matter of taking the temperature, if you will, or getting a sense of temperature of the overall space, so kind of the bigger picture as opposed to just, the temperature of one individual person also. You touched on something I wanted to kind of follow as well about transparency. So one of the things that I see out there as a big need going forward, I mean now, but also going forward, is an adjustment, if you will, in how managers, leaders are trained, right? Because they're not only are they having to find ways to motivate their people that are struggling financially and otherwise, but also finding ways to do that in a remote setting, right? So it's kind of a perfect storm of crisis, if you will, having to retool managers' approaches and styles. Are you seeing any of that out there in the training that you're doing, the support that you're giving to clients? And also are companies realizing that this has to change internally for themselves?
It's a great question, Ken. So in my mind, and I always operated on this, and it is that the first line manager at a company or in an organization is the most important employee in the company. They are the person, be it sales or manufacturing, whatever department they're in. That first line manager is where you have to spend your time to communicate with them, because they are the company to the employee. When you're remote, when I worked in Houston, Texas as a sales rep, my boss was Beckman. And if he was nervous or if he was out of sorts or if he was happy, that's where I went. And so the first line manager is very important. So you have to treat them with respect. You have to give them the tools of understanding and context and, again, transparency, so that they feel good about where the company is going and can represent to their employees and their teams the right messaging. So it's some companies actually don't get that, right? They manage through the first line manager, and the first line manager finds out about whatever at the same time the employees do, which is not good. You only should do that if you're affecting capital markets. And so, the employees look to the manager, and the manager has no choice to say, but, I just found out too. And they may have questions. So I would always make sure that I had a call with the first line managers. And of course, my direct leadership team, and we would loop them in. Sometimes it would be hours before, maybe a day before. And we'd be very transparent about that. We tell the organization, we're going to have a meeting with the managers to get them in line and understanding, and then we're going to have a broad call with everybody else. So if I had any advice and have given to the companies I've worked with, look at your first line manager. That's where it's at. People don't leave companies, they leave managers. Every time. Nobody leaves a company. They leave the manager they're working for. So you got to make sure that manager is getting all the attention from a communication standpoint and a training standpoint and development aim it all at your first line managers, because if they're feeling good about themselves and the company and where the company's headed strategically, the team's going to be fine. But if they're not, you get higher turnover, you get more angst, you get less productivity, and you get a lot of unnecessary stress put on the organization, because these people, the worst thing your boss can say to you is, well, those guys, I don't know what they're doing. That is, but it's fair. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing because nobody's really helped them understand it. So write that down and make sure you do that.
Yeah, and then you have the managers that end up, speaking about their own company in terms of they're doing this, they're not doing
that.
Right,
you get this
we,
they thing, which is poison in a company. But whereas, if the manager's locked in and understands, they can say, well, here's why, and we're going to do this, and this is why we're doing that. That's what you want. Otherwise, employees, especially field employees, to your point, Ken, people that are remote, they get angst. They get really nervous.
Yeah, they do.
Salespeople are the worst because they're like horses. They're thoroughbreds. You want to keep them going.
Right.
Distractions just run them off the track.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to that point, actually, we have a great question from Christian also about that. Are there any specific strategies that you deploy or recommend, especially going through this crisis right now, to keep those field sales folks, or even really marketing operations, anybody out there, because everybody's in the field now because everybody's remote, but things that you've seen or that you recommend that can keep people motivated, right? One of the things I'm talking about a lot with my clients is remembering to celebrate the little wins, and little wins that maybe you wouldn't have acknowledged 6 months ago because they seem too small. Nowadays, every win is significant and should be amplified. But anything specific that you recommend that you've seen?
Yeah, so I come back to this troponin test issue we have with Beckman. So this was a pretty fast-moving problem. Obviously, we were going to customers, and you can imagine if any one of us on the call owned a Starbucks, and the Starbucks corporate person came in and said, well, all I can give you now is coffee, Pike coffee to be specific, and that's it. You'd be pretty upset. And the person coming out of your store would be even more upset because you would have given them your peace of mind. So what we did was, first of all, every day we had 2 calls a day. Because we had time zone from East Coast to obviously West Coast. So we had a call at 8 and we had a call at 5. So that people had an opportunity. It was not mandatory. It was optional. We had close to 1,500 employees that might dial in on days where big announcements were being made. And we would do a couple of things on that call. First off, we would share with them what the latest is, what we know, what we can share. And we were very transparent about things that we didn't have answers to and that we were trying to figure it out. And here's some options we're looking at. To the extent we could be transparent, we were. We would share best practices, what some people are doing. The individual initiative of people in the field or in any job is something you want to tap into. People find ways to communicate in this case, or just be distinct and differentiated in front of their customers in a positive way. They love to share that. And so you give them an opportunity to share what's working for them and in their world at that time, whatever that looks like. And also challenges that people are facing and things they ran up against. And we kind of brainstorm a bit on how to get through that. That could involve any number of different things. It might involve a phone call from a senior leader to an important customer with this, or a Zoom call with an important customer and the sales rep and the manager. It might be a personal letter. It might be an action item for something to be done internally. How can we help you leverage that success in a positive way, or get after that problem and make you look like the hero? So it's not me getting on the call and saying, oh, Vice President, I solved this. It's about giving that sales rep and manager the tools so they can go in and be the hero for the customer and play me anytime, any way they want to play me. So you want to have this dialogue, and we had it twice a day, like I said, and it was, some people called in and just listened. Many people were just passive about it, but they would take things from it in their own way. And then, of course, you have other people that are proud of what they're accomplishing and they want to share it. and we give them the voice to do that. And if it was off the mark, we would say, well, be careful about that commitment because we don't know, right? Because sometimes, I realize you're saying that, but, and everybody would learn from that. We'd all kind of gain a sense that we're in this together, and we will get through it. There's no question we're going to get through this, and we're going to be very different on the other side. But, the entrepreneurial power of, in my opinion, the American story is going to, I realize it's a global challenge, but I think the United States will lead the way in figuring out how to make this work to our global advantage. But those calls were very helpful, and we would give them a heads up if we had major information. We might say, try to join this one either time because this is we got some information to share.
What about in terms, so to that point of as people say, don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? Which is a horrible expression, but it's been around for a very, very long time. Do you feel, one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of our clients out there are trying to find ways to innovate. In some cases, it's just for pure survival of the business. Other cases, it's a chance to take some ideas, some strategies off the shelf that have just been sitting there for a while because there hasn't been the bandwidth, right, or the resources to really commit to it. And now they're saying, well, let's think about doing this or doing that in a way to kind of like you said, if you can only serve coffee now and that's it, how do you find ways to innovate with your companies or with your customers? Are you seeing any of that yet? Is it too soon to tell as far as innovation goes?
Well, I am seeing that actually in my work with NIH. So NIH, by definition, is a government agency, which means working with them is like swimming across a river of molasses. But NIH recognizes that, and by creating this, what they're calling, their words, I don't know if it's an exact replica, but they're using the words of Shark Tank to create this external group that will look at proposals from academic institutions, small companies, and big companies to figure out what's the best and most feasible and how do we help those entities get this to market? What do they need and how can we help with both cash, FDA, regulatory relief, anything that we can do to help, which is one of the reasons we hear about vaccine acceleration, which was 18 months and now it's 6 months. This is all coming from initiatives within the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, looking at what really matters, how can we accelerate and do things differently. And in my career of working with the government on so many levels, and I'm sure many of us on the call have, this is not a high velocity, nimble organization, but they are acting that way. And it gives me personally a lot of hope, if you will, and confidence and excitement. And we saw that we see that with companies too. I've seen it with companies. For example, again, I used to use this comment at Beckman when I ran the life science business, which was about 20% of what was a $3 billion company at that time. And it was like jet skiing behind the oil tanker. Like, let's find a way to get, it's not like anybody's going to die if we make a mistake. So let's try it. I mean, if you think that'll work and you're committed to it, let's go ahead and try it. And so I think a lot of that's going on, and I think it will make us a better and more adaptable workforce, which, if I had to put a word to the most important thing you can do in your career, it's being adaptable and comfortable with change. So many people struggle with that, but now we have to, and people are doing it, and they're finding out, oh, that wasn't so difficult. I think I can do this, and they're seeing the benefits of it. So I think a lot of this is taking place, and I think it's going to make us so much stronger on the other side of it. In many ways, the testing that we're developing, coronavirus is not the last infectious disease on the planet. Infectious disease has been part of our lives since man crawled out of the oceans. So what we're learning is how to diagnose infectious diseases quickly, because vaccine development is not always fast. God bless, AIDS has been around for 40 years. We haven't got a vaccine yet. It's not an easy thing to do. So if you can test and know you don't have it, that gets us a long way towards back to a normal life. And there's going to be other diseases. So the processes and what we're learning in doing this can be applied to the next disease, which will inevitably appear because this is the planet we live on. So we're learning that we can do things that we didn't think were possible. And we've done that before. I remember at times when, in the stories I relayed earlier at Beckman, I used to encourage people to go watch Apollo 13. What a great story, right? It's a great story. I think it's a better analogy for what we're going through now than Shark Tank, but that's a different conversation. Yeah. Everything that can go wrong. What on this spaceship works, but they got back and they did it by individual initiative, creativity, focus. Which is the kinds of things that we have to do now.
I liked your point a little while ago about having the kind of 2 daily meetings, if you will, or check-ins, where people can kind of get a sense for what's the plan for the day and then how did the day go. And I think we're seeing a lot of that as well. We've converted our internal staff meetings, obviously, to Zoom, but we also have made them more frequent. Even our weekly sales calls are on Zoom versus on the phone. So things that you can do to kind of stay connected and stay engaged, I think is really, really important right now. And there's a lot of companies that are doing that. I'm also seeing, and our clients are kind of mid-market and small companies, so not quite as large as Beckman, obviously, or Danaher, but on the mid and small market company side, a lot more kind of bottom up in terms of innovation is happening, where employees that are still there are saying, hey, how about this, how about that? And it seems like in a lot of situations, more so than pre-COVID, a lot of situations, management is listening. And they want to find ways to innovate. They want to find ways to pivot and keeping that transparency going. Are you seeing that at all on your side with your client base?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. It is very obvious that especially senior managers, some of them are really stuck. They're really in a tough spot. Obviously, leadership on any level right now is very challenging. And I think to give people permission to voice things and try things and lean on each other, you have to give them permission, because people are not going to be transparent from the bottom up unless they know it's safe to do so. And sometimes you have to say things like, in the past, I didn't listen as well as I should, and I may have jumped to conclusions, and I want you to know that I recognize that myself, and I'm not going to do that. And I really do want people to voice up. Now, here we come back to the first line manager. Even if it's just 2 levels in the company, aim at your first line manager, because when the boss man says, anybody can pipe up, nobody's going to pipe. They're just not going to pipe up. But if the first line manager says it to his team, and he knows in the relationship he has with his manager who's told him that, then you're in a safer environment. So you have to recognize that there is a hierarchy, and people are simply going to be cautious about raising crazy ideas. And so I've encouraged managers, senior executives who want to get in and send that message, not to do it, because it's not going to be interpreted the way they want, and that they should focus on the person who works for them, who does know them, and who gets through their review and has the understanding, and say, listen, I want you to feel comfortable that you can do this with your team if you think that's the right thing to do. Let's try something. And you have a brainstorming session with your first line managers, because a lot of times they know the answer already, and sometimes they're already doing it. And sometimes it's just getting rid of things that don't make sense. We used to have at Beckman, again, back many, many years ago before computers, we had to have to do call reports. Now, some of you on the phone who were sales reps 20, 30 years ago remember call reports. You'd have to write down. I had to write down every customer I saw, where they were, how long I talked to them, and what I talked to them about, and I had to mail it into my boss. It was a form. I did it every day. It was the biggest. It was second in a pain to expense reports, and I never heard anything back. I never knew who was looking at this. So eventually, I paid no attention to it. You could say, oh yeah, it's kind of a self-help tool, how you're spending your day. But I knew how I was spending my day, and I had my own system. But I filled out this report, and I mailed it in every day. Can you imagine? And I had to keep a carbon copy, and it went somewhere at Beckman. Well, when I became a couple of promotions later, I asked my supervisor, you ever use these reports? You ever see that? He didn't even know what they were. Can you imagine? So I immediately sent a word to my area. At that time it was the Western area. I said, no more call reports because nobody's looking at it. We'll see what happens. Again, kind of jet skiing behind the oil tanker, right? If they have a problem with that, they'll let me know, and then we may have to start again. So the issue is maybe there's ways to take work out, things that the organization could afford to do but can't anymore. At the FDA and our NIH initiative, we're doing a lot of, why do we need to do that? Why can't we start here? A lot of this vaccine development is simply from parallel processing. So we're doing things in parallel that we used to do sequentially because we couldn't get approval to do it in parallel. Well, guess what? God bless the FDA. They're saying, let's try it. And they're even paying for it in many cases. So you can take work out, you can get feedback, you can try different things. The people closest to the customer or closest to the problem, the old adage, they know the answer.
So in terms of kind of the approach and style of communication, obviously we're using Zoom today. A lot of people are using it. There are a number of other alternatives out there also for communication. You had talked earlier on about using the Slack before we got the call started today. Tell us about what tools maybe you're seeing out there or communication platforms maybe that are working. For example, NIH, you talked about working in parallel versus being, kind of separately looking at different options for vaccines. What do scientists use? What do you see out there as platforms that have been effective for communicating?
Well, I think the underlying desire is what I like to call is focused urgency, right? And the good thing about a crisis is when you get up in the morning, there's, you kind of know what to do, right? You don't have a lot of, well, should I, do this today or this today? You kind of know that you have to, save the ship, right? And so you're focused on that, not necessarily activities that are associated with kind of a long-term, building of whatever. So what helps you do that? Clearly the Zoom, and I use that word generically, so whether it's the Microsoft platform or any others, Google, etc. Being able to connect and share screens and look at information, and everybody on the call is in a position to decide. So there's very few, we have to go back to NIH and make a decision on this. I was on a call this morning and we had an FDA regulator on it. And he basically, what we had to do in the past was hire a consultant, do a lot of FDA research and get an answer. It might take 3 weeks. And this guy said, we can do that. We can make that change for this project right now. So being able to look at a spreadsheet with action items and people kind of owning things very quickly is facilitated by these video sharing technologies that we have in place now. Slack is new to me. And so this obviously allows for kind of a record of chat communications with attachments on any number of different projects. So it makes it pretty easy to quickly move at a velocity that the urgency of the situation demands. I wouldn't say that this is an existential threat, but it feels like it.
Hmm.
And from an economical standpoint, one can make the argument that it is. But the reality is the urgency level it drives innovation both in technology and processes. And specifically, it's these video environments and anything that helps communicate, keep record, and move quickly as paramount.
That's great. I like that a lot. There's a lot of kind of talk out there also about kind of the small company, big company issues these days. And in some cases with this current, pandemic, the small company is hurt more so, right? Because they didn't have as much to rely on resources. They had perhaps more debt, or they didn't have quite as much dry powder on the sidelines. On the other hand, the smaller companies can be more agile, right? And they can change strategies. They can move a different direction a little easier than the Verizons or the Beckman Coulters or the AT&Ts of the world. Any sense from you as to how you think as we begin to move through the second half of the year? Do you think we're going to see more innovation, more kind of development of new ideas from the smaller, mid-sized companies, or do you think the innovation is going to come from the larger company landscape out there as far as getting through the crisis and how they manage it effectively?
That's a great question. And so let me share a couple of stories with you, if you will, that will help with that. So when we put out this call at NIH for anybody that's got ideas on how to diagnose the coronavirus test on some platform, come one, come all. And the first phase of companies were small labs and small companies. Sometimes the company was just a researcher, a postdoc, and they formed a company outside of Stanford or MIT. And they had some pretty interesting ideas, some very novel approaches that were very interesting and ultimately approved for going to the next level. And we talked among ourselves, where's the big companies? But the big companies, they take so long and so many levels of approval required for them to even, do we want to get in bed with the government on anything, which is a fair question. So we didn't see a lot of big companies or even small, medium-sized companies get involved. Now we are, because they've gotten through their hierarchical improvement. So 6 to 8 weeks into the game, they're now coming forward. Big companies like Roche or Abbott or any number of these big pharmaceutical diagnostic testing companies. But the most interesting ideas have come from companies not in the space. And I have always believed that innovation comes from outside the industry. And there's lots of examples of it, right? We all know just a couple of them off the top of your head. We've heard the stories about AT&T and Motorola having the cell phone technology, but not really sharing it because, they didn't really think there was a need for it. Or the story about IBM thinking that, only 5 people are going to buy a personal computer. And, Blockbuster, people are never going to download a movie. It takes too long. And Kodak, nobody ever wants to take a picture with their cell phone. Companies that, and we're kind of seeing that in companies that are in the industry, they have a little bit of a, they've worn this pathway of thinking, direct thinking, whatever you want to call it, where they don't really see the innovations that are possible, which we see in companies that in some cases are quite large, but they're not in the diagnostic testing industry. And they're perfect for us because we can clear out all the regulatory and all the quality issues with them, and they have the resources, but it's not their business. So I always think that innovation comes from outside the industry, as painful as that is for a lot of companies to hear. And it is challenging to keep your mind focused on both, because that's what you have to do. Because you have one part of the business that pays the bills, and then you have to look outside. And there's great stories about companies that have done that, but there's more stories about companies that haven't. So smaller companies that don't have the legacy of thinking built around a solution are where I think the innovations, and we're actually starting to see that, is ultimately going to come from.
That's great. And even it's interesting, even on the recruiting side, we so often when we get a new, job spec from a client and invariably it says, must have industry experience. And we always push back on that and we'll say, well, tell us about the makeup of your current organization. And by and large, 90+% of the people that are there come from the same industry. And yet they're trying to hire someone that's supposed to be bringing in some new ideas, new innovation. But if you're all cut from the same cloth, you really kind of get into that group think. So it's the same.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely. We highly encourage clients to consider looking at people from outside the industry if it truly is going to be a more innovative type position, because otherwise you get the same ideas from the same people that get recycled again and again.
Yeah, and when I was running the commercial operations at Beckman, I had certain positions where I knew you didn't really need to know a lot about the company and everything that was going on. And I would always try to hire people from outside not necessarily the industry, but Beckman had a lot of people promoting. There was all this bias to promote. And I would want to bring people in from the outside because they give you different ideas about things that you're just never going to see. And it keeps you fresh. But it's a tough sell, right? If you're trying to bring somebody in new to there, well, we want to promote our person, or he doesn't have industry experience, and that's what you don't want that. And that's what we're seeing at this NIH initiative.
That's great. That's a great example. I mean, again, if you're, you wouldn't equate, or at least I rarely equate innovation or open-mindedness with government, agencies. So it's great to hear that A, the smaller players are the ones that are coming up with the great ideas, and B, and just as importantly, is that NIH is actually listening, because they could very easily dismiss all these small, one-off, 5-person companies and say, oh, well, come back when you're part of Roche or Merck or whoever it is.
Right.
But for them to listen really says a lot also.
And they've actually outsourced this part to us. So we're handling this, and we're all company experts or senior leaders at companies and researchers at Harvard and any number of different high-profile institutions. And we're working outside of the NIH umbrella, and we're moving very quickly. We've gone from 0 to a very high rate of speed in just 6 weeks. It's pretty amazing.
That's great. Wow. So in the few minutes that we have left, you talked a lot about the importance of the frontline managers really kind of driving that transparency, that crisis management, that continued kind of motivation of staff. Any recommendations that you have for those frontline managers when it comes to metrics? Should they be switching up the metrics that they're looking at in terms of evaluating performance and contribution? Should be the same metrics as always? And are there any new, kind of evaluation metrics, if you will, or measures that they should be considering?
Well, so the kinds of things that we would look at when we looked at first line manager performance, and I'm kind of speaking a little bit from a sales perspective here. There's good news, bad news when a sales manager is involved and they have relationships with the 10 sales reps that, let's say 10 or 12 sales reps on the team. So you have to make sure that they're managing that team and leading that team in a fair and professional manner. So how you assign targets, which there's a certain subjectivity to that, at least how they put those targets out. So we would put some expectations around that. And we would measure how many of your sales reps were succeeding. So out of let's say a 3-year period, our expectation was 2 out of 3 years they had a sustained performance. And I used to say that if a sales rep is failing, there's only 3 reasons. One is the quota is too high and the manager is not setting it properly. There's a training issue, or the sales rep's really underperforming. And 2 of those are the manager's accountability. So we would measure how well are you sustaining performance across your team. We would focus on activities that would translate to outcomes that we wanted. So we didn't look too much. You've heard this kind of lagging indicators and leading indicators. You don't look at the grades. You look at how much time you're spending on homework. Where are you spending your time? Coaching, which is woefully inadequate by sales managers to sales reps. They tend to work with their top performers. or they're bottom performers because they've got to put the pressure on them. And the middle, which is where all the meat comes from, they don't spend as much time with. So we would, it's kind of expectations, but we would want to know how often are you spending time in the field or in connection with your team, and how varied is that? Again, all the standard metrics. We would drive operating profit as low as we could to the sales manager, so they had accountability for a revenue and expenses and kind of a margin. So the pricing, we didn't give them a full line P&L, obviously, but we give them those three metrics, and they had to kind of explain, why your margin's slipping, whether the mix of products, not just the pricing. So we teach them, right? They learn what companies really look for. And so we look at that. We look at, I think those are the three things that we would pay a lot of attention to with the first line managers.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think back to your point a few minutes ago also about the innovation piece and it being bottom up. I mean, maybe it's not a tangible metric that you can look at, but just in terms of who's bringing up ideas, who's demonstrating that they're having very in-depth and very consultative conversations with their customers, and that comes up from ideas that might be percolated up from the customer, him or herself. So those kind of things can also be looked at the same time.
I remember when I was at Beckman, we had a part of our portfolio we sold to distributors. Maybe you may on the phone know, VWR or Fisher or whatever. And one team wanted to just move all of this total portfolio line of products to the distributor and not focus on it, let them sell it. The other manager wanted to have one person kind of manage that distributor. So it was a little bit of a resource difference, right? So what I said, I didn't really know the answer, right? So I kind of thought I knew the answer, but I decided to let them both try it for 6 months. And then we get back together as a management team, which was about a dozen at the time, and we'd make a decision which one worked the best. But, it encouraged people to be creative, and we could try things, you pilot things, those kinds of terms. First line managers let's try this, versus saying, well, no, because if I do this for everybody, I got to do it if I do it for you, I have to do it for everybody. Not necessarily. So being flexible and looking for that creativity encourages other people to come up with creative solutions to issues. And, I was always of the mind, let's give it a try. Why not?
Yeah, no, I agree.
I wouldn't bet the whole organization on it. So I said, well, why don't you try it? And then we'll see how that works in 6 months. We'll get back together and see if it works.
Yeah, it's the whole idea it's the whole idea of A/B testing on the marketing side, right? How do you know for sure what marketing strategy or email or subject line is going to work? You test a couple out and see what gets the best response and come back and assess and try it again. Yeah.
Fun. Right.
Yeah, exactly. All right, great. Well, I think we are just about out of time this morning. So thank you for sharing all the examples. It was very interesting to hear about what's happening at NIH. I think it's a great example of the innovation happening out there and the open-mindedness and the collaboration. I think that's, one of the reasons that we've kept these SMLA events going, even, virtual versus in person, because that collaboration is of the utmost importance right now, probably even more important now than it was, pre-COVID. And there's a lot of small business owners that are on the call today and consultants. So it's very helpful to hear your perspective and your approach also. So we appreciate that. Thank you. Are you available on LinkedIn if anybody wants to reach out to you with any other specific questions, Steve? Is that okay?
I am. And I have no problem responding or even having conversations with people if they'd like.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. Great. All right, everyone. Well, enjoy your weekend. If we don't chat beforehand, enjoy your 4th of July celebration the following weekend as well. And then we'll see you back here on July 9th with John Ford from Dialpad. So thanks so much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.